you've heard me say before that it's easier to have faith in the truth of the Bible today than it was 100 years ago, because so many things have been confirmed. And so as we go back, you can kind of start here about 1000 BC. That's the beginning of the United Kingdom. Now that's when Samuel anointed Saul, and that was the first kingdom happened, when you had all the 12 tribes of Israel united under one king. And there were 1, 2, 3 kings during that United Kingdom time, and it lasted about 110, 112 years. This date's actually kind of circa, which means around about 1040. These other dates are a lot more solid. And then we see in 930 BC, so it's about 110 years later. You remember Solomon's son Rehoboam, we talked about that last week, called in the older advisors. They said you should ease off on the taxes, and yeah, it's on ease off on the taxes and the work programs, and he didn't listen to them. He listened to his younger buddies, and because of that, they separated. And you remember, as Tom mentioned at the end of the class, that the 10 tribes in the north said, no longer will our inheritance be with the tribe of Judah, or the family of David. And so what that meant essentially, I thought about that this week and looked at it. So what that meant is, that's why they said, we're Israel and you're not in Israel anymore. And so that's essentially what they were talking about, is no longer is Judah and Benjamin, who was connected to Judah, no longer were they considered a part of Israel. Their inheritance would be separate from that. And so we see Rehoboam was that son of Solomon, and then Jeroboam was not from the family of David. He was just from a sort of a commoner who was a manager of one of the huge work teams from the north, and he became the king of the northern 10 tribes. And we saw the map, of course, last week. And then just in a summary of what's going to happen here, all of the kings of Judah, of the southern kingdom, are all going to come from the family of David. All the kings, and it's chaos over here. Jeroboam, and then there's 17 more 17 more kings, and they come from several different families. So there's no family lineage to follow over here. Actually, some of it's generals and coups and assassinations. Lots of intrigue on this side. Some on this as well, but they're all stay in that line of David. Now, these continue on, and then here's a big date that's also in history, known from archaeological digs. 722, that is when the Assyrians come in and they conquer Samaria, the capital of the northern city. So that is the end of the northern tribe, and that was the northern tribes, and they were carried off into exile. And how the Assyrians did it, they had a huge empire, and how they would control people was actually an interesting tactic that they used. So if they conquered this country and they conquered another country far away, they would take all the important people, pull them all out, and then take all from country A, they take all the important, influential people out, and then they go to country B, and they take all the important, influential people out, and they would switch them into the different countries, or even move them around between 3 or 4 countries. And what that ensured is that there wasn't going to be a rebellion in that country anymore, because all the influential kings and everyone were gone, and they moved in influential people, but there was language barriers, cultural barriers, and then that's why in the northern tribe of Israel, they become known as the Samaritans, because no longer are they Israelites. These foreigners were moved and lived, put into the cities. They literally put them in the houses from the people they had removed, and they gave them cities and towns, and that caused where they couldn't be unified. And so when they did that, the Israelites who were left in their territory began intermarrying with these foreigners that had been moved in, and no longer were they called Israelites. After this defeat, they were called Samaritans, and even into the New Testament time. So Samaritan means the Israelites, the northern 10 tribes, who were not pulled out by the Assyrians, and that intermarried with all the foreigners that the Assyrians brought in. Does that make sense? Does that follow? And that was an interesting tactic that they used, and that way they can control large areas and not have to have rebellions. That's why they did that. Then another 130 years, the southern tribes, the southern kingdom continued. So this kingdom of Judah continued after this one had totally collapsed in 722 for about another 130 years. And you can see here, this one had 18 kings in this amount of time, about 200 years. This one only had 11 kings in over 300 years. So this one had much more stability. It was much more powerful and prosperous because of that. But finally in 586 BC, the Assyrians tried to defeat them. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Weren't able to do it. But then the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar, you'll remember him. We'll get to him a little bit in Daniel. comes in, and they conquer and destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and do a similar sort of thing. They move all the important people. That's how Daniel and all those people are going to get shipped out. They ship out the important people and try to move people in. And so by 586 BC, there is no northern kingdom and there is no southern kingdom. They're both gone. Of course, 40, 50 years later, you're going to see Ezra and Nehemiah are going to move out of exile and move back to Jerusalem, and they're going to start rebuilding Judah. So Judah sort of has a rebirth later on, but Israel is never rebuilt. It just becomes known as Samaria because the people are mixed and they intermarry with the foreigners who are there. So does that basically gives you that timeline and the dates that we're talking about and all the different kings. But let me tell you, when you start looking at these kings, I was going to put a page in a chart, and it is way too confusing. It's all the different, some of these kings were only king. One of them was king for 7 days. One of them was king for 6 months. One of them, and they weren't necessarily married, and there's lots of fighting and intrigue, like I said, and all that sort of stuff. So, top of page 52. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings were so named because of their content. They record the reigns of Solomon and the succeeding kings of Israel and Judah. These books cover a period of some 400 years and tell us of the growth and decay of the kingdoms. We've already studied the book of 1 Kings, which recorded the kingdom being divided and weakened. In the book of 2 Kings, we'll see both Israel and Judah led into captivity. So that means 2 Kings is going to take us all the way until this defeat, and they were carried off into exile. And you'll see the bullet points there that kind of shows you how we're going to look at it. You'll remember we ended the last chapters of 1 Kings talking about Elijah. And not just Elijah, but all the prophets. You remember we have our library over here. All of these prophets live in these times. And when we get to these prophets, we're going to come back to this timeline and show you where they lived. So all of these 17 books of prophets lived in the time of this decay and all these different kings, and that they would speak to different kings. Some of these lived in Israel, the northern kingdom. Some of these lived in the southern kingdoms. And so when we get to those, we're going to refer back to this timeline and show exactly where those people fit. And so we have Elijah and Elisha, though, you'll notice, don't have a book, right? They didn't write a book. So their recordings and the things that they said are actually recorded in 1 Kings, as well as some of those guys are actually names are mentioned in the books, and some of the things they said mentioned in the book of 2 Kings and in Chronicles. So a couple of famous stories about Elijah. Of course, Elijah did, as we did last week, he had the showdown with the prophets at Mount Carmel, and then he went and he found his successor that he was called to call as his successor, Elijah, and then Elisha. And you remember that famous, wonderful story. This is not in your book, but he calls Elisha. And you remember Elisha, what was he doing? He was plowing a field with his oxen. And God called him. This is a great, if you get called to ministry, this is maybe if you've heard this sermon. And when God called Elisha to follow Elijah, he sacrificed. This is how he made his living with the animals. He took both of the ox that he was plowing the field with, sacrificed both of them, broke his plow up into pieces, and used that for the wood to burn his animals that he used to make him live, to say, this is my level of commitment I have to my call. And so Elisha goes on to follow Elijah in that way. And the beginning of the book, we're at the latter years of Elijah and Elisha, who traveled kind of as a team and spoke to a number of the kings. Also, something important that's not mentioned in your book here that you may or may not be aware of. In the Bible, there's sort of 3 clusters of miracles. And I remember when I was younger, I thought, well, there's just miracles all over the place. But there's really 3 clusters when there's lots of unusual supernatural miracles: around Moses, around Elisha and Elijah, and around Jesus. When you look at the intervening times between those 3, there's only a few in between those, but we have in Elijah and Elisha lots of really, like the miracles like we're about to read about, strange supernatural kind of things, as well in the time of Moses and also in the time of Jesus. And so when you read that, you start to see God is telling people to pay attention to something that's going on when he has all these unusual miracles. And that's why Elijah is the most quoted, even though he didn't write one of the books of prophecy. Elijah is the most quoted and talked about prophet in the New Testament, even more than Isaiah, who is probably number 2. So the first really strange and interesting thing that happened. So Elijah and Elisha, they're traveling. Elijah knows his ministry is at the end, his life is at the end. So he's walking. All these other sort of smaller prophets are gathering around. They travel to the Jordan River. And then they get to the Jordan River, and we don't know exactly why, but Elijah is wanting to cross the Jordan River. And he keeps telling Elisha, hey, leave me. I'm going to be going. God's going to take me, and you just need to go on. And Elisha said, I refuse to leave you. I'm going to stay with you. And they had all these other prophets that were tracking with them, so they wanted to get away from them. So guess what Elijah does? Something very strange. He takes his cloak, rolls it up, and throws it in the Jordan River. And what happens? The Jordan River divides so that Elijah and Elisha could walk across the Jordan River. And then once they're on the other side of the Jordan River, a very famous event happens. It became one of the spirituals of the African Americans in the slave days. Y'all know what that spiritual would be? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Right, you know that one? So that comes from this story. You remember when Elijah, he was there, and there was chariots of fire that came down, and he'd actually get in the chariot, but a whirlwind carried him up. And so that's the next, kind of the final part of Elijah's life, is he's actually carried up into heaven. He doesn't die, but they're in the midst of, with Elijah looking on, he's carried up in a whirlwind. And then on the top of page 53, I'm going to go a little slow. I know you're writing. And there was also a movie, right? Chariots of Fire. That's where that name also comes from, that story with Elijah. So then top of 53, Elijah is gone. He's out of the picture. And Elisha carries on, as you see on top of page 53. Elisha continues to minister for 50 years. And, if you remember back in our very, very first lesson, and this is going to be on your test, by the way, in a few weeks down the road, what is a prophet? Does anyone remember from our very first lesson? Let me see if I can find it. I think it was here. It's on page 3. And so, yep, that's the kind of how they decide whether they are. So a prophet just means someone who's a spokesman. So like kings would have what they call prophets. So the prophet we're talking about in the context of the Israelite people is a spokesman for God. So God gives a special message to a messenger. And then as Gil was saying, it was a simple test. They would do two things. One is they would forthtell. And forthtell means they would be like a preacher. They'd say, repent, turn back to God, do what you should be doing, and God will bless you, and so forth. They would do that. All these prophets, almost all of them, have this just sort of proclaiming and calling people to follow the Lord. And then they had another that's called that forthtelling. The other one's called foretelling. And a lot of them, not all of them, but some of them would predict future events. And that's what you're referring to. If they ever predicted a future event and it didn't happen, then they were known to be a false prophet and they'd be put to death. And so that was the penalty for that. So, we have a lot of modern day prophets on TV that say, I'm one of the new prophets and apostles of God. And I saw an interview with one of them. He said, well, modern prophets, if we shoot for about 60 to 70% accuracy. That's what he said on TV. And you just thought, what is this guy talking about? Okay, I'm not going to go there tonight. We'll get us off track. Okay, so back to our page 53. As we were talking about this, Israel, so you see Jeroboam, who was after the split of the kingdom. And then Jeroboam, there were 5 kings after him. There's lots of intrigue. A few of them were his kids, and then it changed to another family because of some fighting. And then there was a general. We'll talk about the one that lasted for 7 days. He was a general that kind of did a coup. And then another general did another coup and killed him. He was only king for 7 days, and the people didn't like him. And that guy's name was Omri. And then Omri had a son. And that son's name we talked about last week was named Ahab. And then Ahab had a very famous wife who was a Phoenician from Sidon. And what was her name? She was a bad girl, Jezebel, right? So she was a foreigner that came in. Of course, she was the really powerful, influential woman who brought in all this idolatry and had it widespread. And Ahab would just kind of let her do whatever she wanted to do. And so Ahab had, Jezebel, they built their capital city there in Samaria, and right next to it, there was a man who had a vineyard. and she wanted that property. She said, I want to have a garden where that vineyard is. So she went to the man and she said, I want your garden. I'll buy you another. I'll give you some land. He said, I'm not going to do it. This is my family land. And so you can read the story. Ahab got upset, where she went to Ahab and complained to him. Then he got upset. And they basically set the guy up in a court and had false charges brought against him and then had him executed so they could have their garden. Next, that'll tell you the kind of quality of people. And it says about Omri, his father, that he was more evil in the sight of the Lord than every king before him. And then guess what it says about Ahab, the very next one. And Ahab was more evil than any king before him. So that's not saying much, because his dad had just said the same thing, the chapter 4, about his father. So Ahab was a total failure. The northern tribe, remember, he's in Israel. The northern tribes in all kinds of idolatry. Even after the showdown between Elijah and Jezebel's prophets. And so it comes to the point where Joram, which is the grandson of Ahab, is the king, and he's also not doing things very well. And then Elisha, who we've just been talking about, instructs a man named Jehu to go and to finish him off because he was sick. And he appointed or anointed this new Jehu. And Jehu was from a totally different family. So basically Omri had Ahab, so it had been in the line of Ahab for 5 generations, and they were going to end that. So Elisha said, this family, God's done with this family, sort of like he'd done with Saul before, and he anointed this man named Jehu. And then Jehu goes in and kills Joram, or he's also known as Jehoram. He has 2 names he's called by. And then there's the famous story where he goes back to, it mentions there in the paragraph in the middle of page 53, as he goes back to Samaria where their house is. He kills Jehoram, and then he orders the body to be cast out on the very ground Joram's grandfather Ahab had stolen from Naboth. Now Naboth is that guy that had the vineyard. So he said, I want you to take the body of this king who's so horrible, and I want you to throw his body out and bury him in the field that his father stole from this man. And then they go, and this is his grandmother now, so she's an older lady, but she's in their house on an upper floor, and they come into the city to take care of her as well. And here's the scene we have summarized here. The scene looks like this. She paints her face because she is the lead priestess for all the worship of all the Baal, and they would do their makeup and all this sort of thing. So she was all dressed up in her pagan Baal worshiping outfit and uniform because she'd been leading worship. And so they called up to her eunuchs. Now, if you were an attendant to the queen or the princess, they would castrate the men so that there wouldn't be any kind of threat, so there would never be any intrigue about whose child is it. So her eunuchs, which were her attendants up there, and of course everybody hated her, I think, probably, and so her own servants threw her out of the window, and it said that she hit the ground so hard that her blood spattered on the horses, which then trampled her. And then they just left her body on the ground for a while and went in and had a little meeting. And then by the time they came out to get her body, it said just a carcass and the palms of her hands were all that were left, because the dogs had come and consumed her body.
Jezebel.
That's Jezebel. So she did not have a happy ending. And so here, the reason this Jehu, and this is an important point, because this is a major different family. You'd had 5 generations under Ahab's family, and now you're going to shift to a totally new family in Jehu, and this one is going to go almost to the end of the reign. Functionally, that's a big change right in the middle, because his descendants, Jehu's descendants, and none of them are going to be very good, but they're the dynasty that goes into the final years of the northern tribes. As it says there, his great-grandson Jeroboam II is the last able leader of Israel before its collapse. And it talks about they went into a new heyday and so forth and so on that you can read. And the thing you have to remember is you always had 2 sets of kings, and that's why it gets complicated. And I didn't put all the names up here because it's very complicated, because you have these kings over here and you have kings over here, and they ascend to the throne and go out of the throne. It's hard to know all the dates. It's very confusing. But you know, famous King Josiah from the passage in Isaiah. So King Josiah, he was the king about the same time as Jeroboam. So both of them at that time became very powerful. But Jeroboam II was the last time there was really a functional state of Israel. It came into major decline. And then eventually something happened. You'll see that at the bottom of page 53 in 2 Kings 17. That this final descendant, Hoshea, he's the king. And Assyria has come in and kind of surrounded them, controlled a lot of the countries, and they're wanting them to pay tribute, and the king refuses to. And so Assyria comes in, besieges the city of Samaria for 3 years. Can you imagine being besieged for 3 years? Surrounded the city for 3 years, and people are basically starving to death. And they conquer them, and then what we talked about earlier, they took all the important people, carried them out, brought in foreigners, and moved the foreigners into the houses of the people so that they would never be able to unify and make a country again. Do you have a question, Patrick?
You don't have a map up tonight. Is Assyria and Syria the same place?
You're going to have a map, page 56. I'll get it up there in just a second. We'll answer that question when we get to it. That's a great question. They're connected, but not exactly the same. All right, so top of page 54. So it mentions there, as we talked about, I think also last week, that's why they call it the lost 10 tribes of Israel, because these tribes, once the final collapse, Assyria carries them off, they're never reorganized again. So they're referred to as the lost 10 tribes because they get carried off here and there, and they end up mixing and marrying, and their bloodlines become mixed with all these foreigners, and they become, as it says, they're half-breeds. And that's why when you get to the New Testament, because remember, Judah is going to get rebuilt, and the Jewish people move back in, the tribe of Judah, and then they look to the north, and all their old ancestors they've rejected parts of the scripture, they've intermarried with all these foreigners, and so they hate them worse than they hate just about anyone else, the Samaritans. And then we have in chapter 17, verse 7, it tells us why God allowed this to happen to the nation of Israel. And it's not that hard. Do you know remember what the very first and second of the 10 commandments were? You shall have no other what? Gods before me. So that's number one. You don't have to go very far down the list. They sinned against God by worshiping heathen gods. And they just didn't do it on a small scale. They did it on a monumental scale. There's a passage in there that says there wasn't a tree in Samaria that didn't have a pagan thing on. Every single tree in the capital city was adorned with these heathen and pagan gods. So it was wholesale rejection of course, every commandment, but number one, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then we go on to talk about Judah. So Israel now is out of the picture. They've been carried off, and now all that's left is the southern kingdom. We're going to get to a map here in just a second. And Judah, which of course is the southern kingdom, survives for more than a century after the northern kingdom of Israel is gone. And of course, they're not very strong in this time, but at least they're surviving. And so Assyria came in. Assyria tried to surround the city. And you remember that story when you have Isaiah, and one of the kings we're going to talk about in just a moment. They surround the city. And King Hezekiah is wanting to surrender. He said, we don't have a chance against this Assyrian army. They've just wiped out the northern tribes. They've wiped out all these countries. There's no way we can do it. And then through an amazing thing with a piece of paper, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but you should go read it there in chapter 19. God intervenes, and he tells them, I'm going to fight them for you. And I'm going to read this passage of what God's prophecy was. This is the prophet says this. And this is what the prophet wrote in a letter to the king of Assyria. He wrote a letter from God to the king. And this is what part of the letter says. Remember, this is to the king of the Assyrians who are sieging around Jerusalem. He says, God says this, have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from the days of old what now I will bring to pass, that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded, and have become like plants of the field, and are like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighting before it's known. But listen to what God says to the king of Assyria, the most powerful king in the world. He says, but I know you're sitting down and you're going out, you're coming in, and your raging against me. Because you have raged against me, and your complacency has come into my ears," this is my favorite part, God says, "I will put a hook in your nose and a bit in your mouth, and I will turn you around and send you right back where you came from." Okay, so they were surrounded by this huge army, and God told him to write that letter, send it to the king. And then this happened. They don't know, no one knows, was it sort of a plague or what happened, but 180, this is a humongous army. Sometimes in those times they'd have armies of 500,000 people back in those days. And 185,000 of these men died. And guess what they did? Turned right back around and went back to their capital in Assyria. And so Judah, that's why Judah survived for over 100 more years, because God defeated them. The Israelites did not turn to God. They were wiped out, but because Judah turned back to God and put their faith in him, God delivered them. And then sometime after that, there's a king named Josiah, one of the best kings. And he was 8 years old. Whoop, I kind of cut to it there. He was only 8 years old when he was made king. Now, he didn't actually ascend to the throne until he was 16, but he was determined to be the king when he was 8 years old. And he was one of the finest kings. But this shows you the state in just a generation or two that happens. This is how bad it was. He decided he was going to send the priests to go clean up the temple because they didn't use it anymore. They hadn't done Passover. They didn't know. And so they went, and then the priest came back to him and said, "Hey, while we were cleaning up the temple, we found this book." And guess what it was? It was the Torah. It was the law of Moses. They didn't even know where it was. It was lost somewhere in the temple. When they were cleaning up, they found it, and he had them read it to them. And then as he read it, they read it to him. He said, "We're going to turn things around, and we're going to follow what God wants us to do." And so he had to call all the people in, had a huge meeting. They had a big fast, and they read the whole Torah to the whole people. And then they reinstituted something that had not been practiced in over a generation: the Passover. Now, what was the Passover? What was the Passover? It's a festival to remember something. What is that to remember?
The last plague was in Egypt.
Yep, the 10th plague in Egypt. And so when they sacrificed the lamb, you remember they went through the whole process. They would have to sacrifice a lamb. They would commemorate that holiday. And of course, for us, that's very important, because in the New Testament, remember, it's Passover night. It's when Jesus is arrested and he is hung on the cross on the day of the Passover, which would have been in April. Middle of April is when they celebrated that. So he reinstituted the Passover. And it says here, you can go back to page 18. We talked about that. So the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. Now, why is Nineveh famous? Which one of these minor prophets over here is connected to Nineveh? Jonah. There we go. Remember Jonah? Does that sound familiar? So now Jonah actually lived before the time we're talking about. We'll bounce around a little bit when we get to the prophets. So in just a couple generations before, that was the capital of Assyria, is where Jonah was told to go. And the Assyrians were terrible people. They would literally pile up skulls. When they conquered a city, they'd kill all the men. They'd take all the heads. They'd make a big pyramid and leave it at the front of the city as a message to anyone who would go against them. That's why Jonah didn't want to go talk to him. So we have Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. But after this huge defeat that they had, they lost all these men. They were conquered by the Babylonians. Now the Babylonians would eventually be headed by a guy, you'll see at the top of page 55, Nebuchadnezzar. Now again, we can connect that to names over in our prophets. When you think about King Nebuchadnezzar, who do you think about in the prophets? Daniel and the Shadrach, Meshach, Daniel and the lions. And that was King Larry Boy, yeah.
What do they call him?
Yeah. That's exactly right. So I'm just bringing that forth so how these things are connect. Once we get to the prophets, we're going to dip back into these books of history to show where they all show up. So here we see but we're getting the picture. That's the Babylonians here. They're going to come in. They're going to conquer Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple, destroy the city walls of Jerusalem. They're going to carry Daniel and all these important people, same sort of technique. They're going to carry them all out of the city, but they don't bring in and put foreigners in. The Babylonians do a little bit differently. They just take all the smartest, most educated people. They take them to their capital in Babylon, and their strategy was to just make them into Babylonians. So what they wanted to do is take the young men, young women that are really bright, take them to our capital, teach them our language, teach them our culture, show them how much, kind of like Alexander the Great would do not long after that, would enculturate them, turn them into Babylonians, and then the plan was to send them back to their own people, but as cultural Babylonians, and that way they would promote the Babylonian culture. So a little bit different than the Assyrians. The Assyrians would trade people out, and the Babylonians would bring people out, enculturate them, and then put them back, and then they would be able to serve as vassal states. Okay, so that sort of brings us, and you'll see that after this fall, we're going to go to the books next week. We'll be talking about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so after this defeat in 586, everybody's out in exile. Not everybody, but a lot of the people in Judah are in exile. Israel's even in worse shape because they had shipped people out and moved people in. And so these people have been in exile. Jerusalem is destroyed, totally destroyed at the end of 2 Kings. And you'll see there 1st and 2nd Chronicles is simply restates, except it focuses. So we're not going to go over 2nd Chronicles because it's really just the exact same information that we have in 1st and 2nd Kings, except it focuses on lineages and bloodlines, and it kind of lists, and you'll see in 1st Kings it'll say everything is listed in the Chronicles because they talk about the bloodline. So 1st Chronicles really covers the exact same time that 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, they overlap. There's a few extra details, but no big details that we need to talk about, but it does mention one thing here that's not mentioned in 1st and 2nd Kings, that the first tribes, whenever the Assyrians came in, the first tribes which were conquered were Manasseh. What was the other ones on the east? Let me go to the map here. Oh, sorry, I've lost my place here. That I didn't write that passage down. That the 2.5 tribes that had set on the east side of the river, and it was Manasseh. I can't remember the other one. I want to say Ephraim, but that may be not right. But there were 2 tribes. You remember when they came in, and Moses said, we're going to cross the river, and 2 tribes said, well, we like it on this side, so we want to stay on this side. And he said, well, as long as you come help your brothers, you can come back. And of course, it was those tribes who settled not in the promised land. They settled on the east side of the Jordan. They were the first ones that were utterly destroyed by the Assyrians when they came in. So they're the first ones to be taken captive. So we see kind of that biblical principle of your sin will find you out. All right, now to our map. We're going to fill in some blanks here. What famous gulf bordered both the Assyrian and Babylonian empires? Now, here's the answer Patrick's question. So modern-day Syria is here. Assyria, they're not really the same people. Maybe there's some overlap, but the Assyrians really controlled a huge vast in their empire, but they were sort of like Persians, maybe modern-day Persians. So there is some connection, but they're really different. But I'm not honestly sure what the connection is in the name, but I'm sure there's some connection. Maybe some of their remnants were left there when they were conquered. And then after the Assyrians, then we have the Babylonians come in and knock out the Assyrians. And of course, you always have Egypt down here, which stayed for almost always. They were powerful. And that was the problem. This is all a huge desert right here. So the reason this was such an important place, the Holy Land even today, is because that's the passageway. There's not very few roads. There were no roads back then to cross here. The main highway that connected Africa to the rest of the world went right through Israel. It's called the King's Highway. And so you have, every time Egypt got in a spat with one of these, guess who was right in the middle? So for that reason, they would want to come in and control this area. Then they would try to fight and come in and control, and there was always fighting going on. All right, so what famous gulf? We fought a war when I was in high school, right? Iraq up here invaded this little country of Kuwait. Kuwait calls our president and says, come help us. We have a huge military base here in Saudi Arabia. So we fought the Gulf War. And the Gulf War is basically whenever Saddam Hussein entered Kuwait, is we fought to push them out of Kuwait. So that is the Persian Gulf. All right, the next question is, what rivers flowed through the middle of both empires? And these, of course, one of them flows right through downtown Baghdad. All right, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. The Euphrates, by the way, Babylon is basically in the same place that Baghdad. Very similar. Not exactly sure things are exactly right, but more or less. And then we've already mentioned it. What was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Remember, you had the Assyrians were in power first. They wiped out the northern 10 tribes. They were defeated at Jerusalem by God. They came back, and then they were weakened, and then the Babylonians came in and wiped them off. So when the Assyrians were in power, the capital was Nineveh. You can see it all the way up here. It's by the Tigris River. And you remember that's where God sent old Jonah to. And they listened. But you remember he hated those people, didn't he? He hated them. He didn't want to go. And then, of course, the capital of Babylon, the capital of Babylonia was Babylon. And you can see these little dark gray things are just the modern day countries that are there now. 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles. Any questions or comments?